The story opens with an immediate sensory and emotional jolt, the violent crash of books against marble and the raw, nonverbal screaming of a child in crisis. "Someone get up there. Now." Alexander Brooks' command ricocheted through the estate's corridors, desperate enough to crack the veneer of his control. This sets up an immediate contrast between the calculated perfection of the Brooks mansion and the chaotic, unmanageable human suffering trapped within its forbidden third floor. It establishes Naomi not just as an employee, but as the only person willing to break protocol to answer pain. The oak office smelled of leather and old money, the kind of room where men signed deals that moved markets. Naomi sat in a chair that probably cost more than her car, still wearing her maid's uniform, while Alexander Brooks stood by the window overlooking grounds she'd need a map to navigate. Lucas was diagnosed at 4, he said, his voice stripped of the command it had carried in the library. Late, they said. Too late for early intervention to make the difference it should have. He turned, and Naomi saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. His mother, Catherine, she understood him in ways I never learned. She died 2 years ago. Car accident. Since then, Lucas hasn't. He stopped, clearing his throat. He hasn't let me touch him. Not once. Naomi watched him struggle with words that clearly didn't come naturally to a man who built empires on confidence. I've hired specialists from Boston, New York, Switzerland. Occupational therapists, behavioral analysts, speech pathologists. They last 3 weeks on average before they quit or I fire them. He pulled an envelope from his desk. What you did today, I don't know what that was, but I need it. I need you. The offer was simple and staggering, 5 times her current salary, live-in position, full benefits. Naomi's hands trembled as she held the paper. This was Tasha's rent for 6 months. This was the surgery her grandmother needed. This was breathing room her family hadn't had in years. The staff will tell you he's impossible, Alexander said quietly. They're not entirely wrong. But you weren't afraid of him. I wasn't afraid for him, Naomi corrected. There's a difference. She signed the contract with a pen that weighed like gold because it probably was. That night, calling Tasha from her tiny apartment, Naomi's voice broke when her sister cried with relief. But long after the call ended, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she'd just accepted salvation or signed up to fail another child who desperately needed her to understand a language she'd barely learned herself. The guest house was larger than Naomi's entire apartment, with windows that let in light Lucas probably found overwhelming. She spent her first night there learning the architecture of silence, how the main house went quiet after 9, how the estate settled into itself like a held breath. Lucas's world revealed itself in patterns. He organized his toys by color, never mixing them, red cars with red blocks, blue puzzles with blue books. He'd spend 20 minutes running his fingers over the velvet curtains in the sitting room, his face peaceful in a way Naomi never saw elsewhere. The piano in the corner drew him daily, though he never touched the keys, just pressed his palms flat against the wood and stood there, absorbing something Naomi couldn't name. She began with observation, nothing more. When Lucas arranged his breakfast by color, grapes separate from strawberries, never touching, she didn't interfere. When he spent an hour watching dust move through sunlight, she sat nearby and watched too, trying to see what captivated him. The staff watched her with skepticism barely concealed. You'll learn, the head housekeeper said, not unkindly. The boy has his ways. Best not to disturb them. But Naomi had learned with Marcus that, not disturbing often meant not connecting. So she created a visual schedule using colored cards, green for breakfast, blue for music time, yellow for outside, and hung them where Lucas could see. She cleared a corner of his room and built what she called his calm space, weighted blankets in gradients of blue, noise-canceling headphones, and squares of different fabrics, velvet, silk, cotton, mounted on a board he could touch when words were too much. The first time Lucas voluntarily went to that corner during a difficult moment and put on the headphones himself, Naomi felt the smallest flicker of something she'd thought died with Marcus. Not redemption exactly. but possibility. Naomi found her rhythm with Lucas in the spaces between schedules. Mornings were for routine, afternoons for gentle exploration, evenings for winding down the world until it was small enough for him to hold. But there was always an absence in the room, a shadow that never entered fully. Alexander appeared in doorways but never crossed thresholds. He'd pause while passing Lucas's room, watch them work with the colored cards or sit in companionable quiet, then check his watch and disappear with murmured excuses about conference calls and quarterly reports. On a Thursday morning, when Alexander stopped in the doorway for the third time, Naomi made a decision. Lucas was sorting fabric samples by texture, content in his task. "You can come in," she said without looking up. "He won't break." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I have calls." "You've had calls every day this week. All perfectly timed for when you might actually have to be here." She met his eyes then, and something in her directness made him flinch. "When's the last time you just sat with him?" The silence stretched thin and painful. Alexander stepped inside but stayed near the door, expensive shoes on expensive carpet, every muscle in his body coiled like he was preparing for combat or flight. "I don't know what to do," he said finally, the admission costing him something visible. "I look at him and I see every way I've failed. Every specialist who quit. Every time I tried to hug him and he screamed. I've spent 2 years treating him like a project with variables I can't control, and the truth is," his voice cracked, "I'm a stranger in my own son's life." Naomi gestured to the floor beside her. "Then stop trying to fix him. Just sit." Alexander looked at the floor like it was a foreign country. But slowly, carefully, he lowered himself down. Lucas didn't acknowledge him, but he didn't flee either. For 10 minutes they sat in silence, and Naomi watched a billionaire learn the first lesson of love: sometimes presence is enough. The velvet hair wrap had been Naomi's grandmother's, deep purple, soft as a secret. She wore it most days, practical and beautiful at once. Lucas noticed it the way he noticed everything that pleased his senses, but Naomi didn't realize how much until the afternoon he reached for it. She'd been reading to him, not expecting him to engage, just filling the air with gentle sound, when his fingers extended toward her head. She froze, barely breathing. Marcus used to do this too, right before the breakthroughs. "You want to touch it?" she asked softly. Lucas's hand hovered, trembling with want and hesitation. Naomi slowly unwrapped the fabric and held it out. He took it like she was handing him something holy, brought it to his face, and closed his eyes. The tension melted from his small shoulders. She let him keep it that day, and the next. He carried it to his calm corner, draped it over his lap during meals, held it during transitions that usually undid him. The wrap became a bridge between his world and theirs. Alexander found them one evening, Lucas curled against Naomi's side with the velvet pressed to his cheek. Naomi had her arm loosely around him, not restraining, just there, and Lucas hadn't pulled away. For a child who recoiled from touch like it burned, this was resurrection. Alexander stood in the doorway, and Naomi saw his face do something complicated. He left without speaking, but the next morning, packages arrived, velvet clothing in Lucas's size, a weighted vest lined with silk, blankets in textures that invited touching. The note, in Alexander's precise handwriting, was brief: "Thank you for seeing him." That night, when Naomi went to return the hair wrap, Alexander stopped her. "Keep it with him. God knows it's done more good there than anywhere else." His voice was rough. "I spent 2 years buying solutions. You gave him a piece of yourself. I don't know how to." He trailed off, and Naomi understood. Some men built empires because they didn't know how to build intimacy. "You're learning," she said gently, and something in his eyes gentled at the permission. Music was the accident that became salvation. Naomi had been cleaning Lucas's room when she noticed him standing by the piano again, hands flat against its side, utterly still. On impulse, she pulled out her phone and played a Chopin nocturne through his noise-canceling headphones. Lucas's whole body softened. He didn't smile, he rarely did, but something in him eased, like a door opening onto a quiet room he'd been searching for. For 20 minutes he stood there, hands on the piano, lost in sound. Naomi mentioned it to Alexander that evening. 2 days later, his childhood piano instructor, an elegant woman named Mrs. Chen who taught at Juilliard, appeared at the estate with an offer Naomi couldn't refuse and didn't want to accept. "Mr. Brooks mentioned you might benefit from lessons," Mrs. Chen said, settling at the piano with the grace of someone who'd spent 60 years with the instrument. "Shall we begin?" The lessons were humbling. Naomi's fingers stumbled over keys, her rhythm uncertain, but Mrs. Chen was patient in the way of people who understood that music was a language requiring translation. "For the boy," she'd say when Naomi's frustration mounted. "Play for him." 3 weeks in, Naomi was attempting a simplified Mozart piece when Alexander entered. He stopped, listening, then moved to the piano. "May I?" His hands knew the keys like old friends. The piece he chose was complex and achingly beautiful, and Naomi watched his face transform, grief and memory and something like peace moving across his features. This was Catherine's song. She knew it without being told. Lucas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the music. For 5 minutes, an eternity in his world, he stood there listening. Didn't flee. Didn't cover his ears. Just existed in the sound his father made. When the final notes faded, Alexander's shoulders shook silently. Lucas took 3 steps into the room. Didn't touch, didn't speak, but he was there, and that was everything. Naomi slipped out quietly, leaving father and son in the language they'd just discovered they shared. Rebecca Thorne arrived like weather, expected, dreaded, and impossible to redirect. She swept through the estate with the entitlement of someone who'd known Catherine since childhood and considered the Brooks family partially hers by association. She found Lucas in the garden, hands deep in mud, making patterns only he understood while Naomi sat on a nearby bench reading. The sight stopped Rebecca cold. "What on earth?" She turned to Naomi, ice in her voice. "You're letting him play in dirt like some kind of animal." Naomi stood slowly. "He's exploring texture. It's called sensory play, and it's actually. I don't care what you call it. Where is Alexander?" The confrontation happened in the library, voices rising until they weren't voices anymore but weapons. Lucas heard from the garden. Naomi saw him freeze, saw his hands go to his ears, saw the meltdown building like a storm. "You're allowing the help to let your son behave like," Rebecca's voice cut through walls. Lucas ran. Not away, but toward. He crashed into Naomi's legs and pressed his face against her thighs, his whole body shaking. She wrapped herself around him, a shelter made of flesh and fabric and fierce protection. The library door opened. Alexander stood there, something dangerous in his stillness. "Get out." "Alexander, I'm trying to help you see." "I said get out." He moved toward them, toward Lucas trembling against Naomi. "My son chose who makes him feel safe. I suggest you respect that." Rebecca left in a fury of expensive perfume and wounded pride. The house settled. Lucas's breathing slowly evened. That night, Alexander found Naomi in the kitchen. "What if she's right?" The words came out broken. "What if I'm being selfish keeping him here when I can't give him what he needs? When I don't even know what that is?" Naomi looked at him, this man who commanded boardrooms but crumbled before his own son's needs. He needs someone who'll sit on the floor with him at galas in $1,000 tuxedos. The question is, are you willing to be that person? Alexander's silence was his answer taking shape. The sign language book arrived on a Tuesday, sent by a specialist Alexander had consulted months ago and dismissed as too alternative. Naomi found it in the library and saw possibility where others had seen desperation. She started simple, more, all done, help, safe. Basic signs that gave Lucas tools for a world that demanded words he couldn't produce. She practiced them constantly, narrating her signs like a teacher, making them visible, repeatable, learnable. The breakthrough came 3 weeks in. Lucas, frustrated with a puzzle that wouldn't cooperate, looked at Naomi and signed, "Help," clumsy, uncertain, but unmistakable. She signed it back, then helped him. The relief on his face was transcendent. "Teach me," Alexander said that evening, appearing in the doorway with something humble in his posture. "Whatever you're doing, I want to learn it." So they began. After Lucas's bedtime, they sat at the kitchen table, neutral territory where employer and employee became something harder to name, and Naomi taught Alexander the grammar of hands. He was a quick study, his business-sharp mind applying itself to memorization and repetition. "Why didn't any of the specialists suggest this?" he asked one night, practicing safe until his fingers found the right shape. "They probably did. But you weren't ready to learn it." Naomi's voice was gentle. "You were still looking for a cure. This isn't about curing anything. It's about connecting." The first time Lucas signed safe while looking directly at Naomi, Alexander was present. The boy's hands formed the word, his eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. Alexander's hands moved slowly, carefully, signing safe back to his son. Lucas watched, then looked away, but he didn't flee. Progress measured in moments that others might have missed entirely. Later, walking Naomi back to the guest house, Alexander stopped. "I don't know how to thank you for giving me a language to speak to my son." "Then don't thank me," Naomi said. "Just keep learning it." But her hand brushed his as she turned away, and neither of them mentioned the electricity that brief contact sparked. The Bennett Gala was Catherine's legacy, a foundation supporting childhood medical research, an event that raised millions annually. Alexander couldn't not attend. But this year, he made a choice that raised eyebrows from the moment invitations specified 3 names, Alexander Brooks, Lucas Brooks, and Miss Naomi Williams. Rebecca's objections were immediate and public. "You can't bring the boy. It's too much stimulation, and if he has an episode." "Then I'll handle it," Alexander said with a finality that ended the conversation. The ballroom glittered with champagne flutes and designer gowns, with donors whose wealth could fund small nations. Lucas, in his velvet-lined vest and noise-canceling headphones, held Naomi's hand like a lifeline. For an hour, he managed. Then the orchestra swelled for the program opening, and the sound became a physical thing that pressed against him from all sides. Naomi felt him begin to fracture. His hand tightened, his breathing changed, and she knew they had seconds before the meltdown became public. She looked for an exit. Alexander saw it too. He excused himself from a senator mid-sentence and moved toward them. But instead of ushering them away, he did something that stopped conversations across the room. He sat down on the ballroom floor, custom tuxedo and all, and opened his arms. "I've got you," he said, signing safe with hands that shook slightly. "I'm here." Lucas looked at him, at Naomi, at the crowd that was suddenly too close. Then he collapsed into his father's chest, fingers clutching expensive wool, and pressed his face against Alexander's shoulder. He didn't let go. Not for 10 minutes, not while cameras flashed and gossip ignited like wildfire. Alexander held his son and let the world watch. He signed safe over and over against Lucas's back, and Naomi saw him mouth words that might have been prayers or promises or apologies for all the years he'd let fear keep him standing when he should have been sitting on floors. Later, the photo would go viral, billionaire Alexander Brooks on his knees, son in his arms, choosing his child over his image. But in that moment, there was just a father learning that love means meeting someone in their world rather than demanding they live in yours. 3 months later, the transformation was written in details others might have missed. The mansion's lighting had been adjusted, softer, warmer, with dimmers in every room. Furniture had been rearranged to create clear pathways and eliminate overwhelming choices. The 3rd floor was no longer forbidden territory but a space designed for one small boy's specific way of existing. Alexander had restructured his entire professional life. He worked from home 4 days a week, attended only critical meetings, and turned down speaking engagements that once would have been automatic acceptances. His board questioned the changes. His therapist called it healthy. Lucas simply responded by gradually allowing his father deeper into his world. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, Naomi was making breakfast, scrambled eggs separated from toast, orange juice in a blue cup, while Alexander reviewed quarterly reports at the kitchen table. Lucas appeared in the doorway, barefoot, hair uncombed, holding the purple velvet wrap like a talisman. He walked to Alexander. Took his hand. Lifted it and placed it carefully on top of his own head. The request was clear: touch me. Hold me. Be here with me. Alexander's breath caught. His hand trembled as he slowly, reverently, brought his other arm around his son. Lucas leaned into him, didn't pull away, and for the first time in 3 years, Alexander held his child without fear of rejection. Naomi turned away to hide her tears, but Alexander saw them. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, he asked her to meet him in the library. The leather folder on the desk wasn't what she expected. Not a termination. Not a performance review. Inside were papers that made her heart stop and restart, legal documents with Lucas's name, her name, and the word adoption repeated in official language. My world stopped the day I watched you comfort my son, Alexander said, standing close enough that she could see the silver threading through his hair, the vulnerability he usually hid behind boardroom confidence. It started again when you taught me how to be his father. He took her hand, signing safe against her palm. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee. I'm asking you to build a family with us. With me. Naomi's tears came freely now. You're sure? I've never been more certain of anything. His voice was rough with emotion. You gave me my son back. Let me give you both a home. She signed safe back to him, then kissed him, gentle, tentative, full of promise. Behind them, unnoticed, Lucas appeared in the doorway. He watched them, then walked forward and placed his small hand on top of their joined ones. 3 hands. 3 heartbeats. One family built not from blood or obligation, but from the patient, deliberate choice to learn each other's languages and meet each other in the spaces where words fail but presence speaks everything. They were, finally, whole.